He was the voice that made a whole generation believe that nothing in life was worth taking too seriously. Not heartbreak, not failure, not even fame itself. Dean Martin built an entire career on looking like a man who never worried about anything. A drink in his hand, a song on his lips, a wink for the camera. To millions of fans, he was the picture of effortless cool, the kind of star who seemed untouched by the chaos that destroyed so many of his contemporaries. But the real story of Dean Martin was never as simple as the image he sold on stage. Underneath the tuxedo and the easy laugh was a man who spent his final years quietly disappearing, worn down by grief he never fully processed and loneliness he rarely admitted to. And through much of that decline, one woman kept a careful, respectful distance while still watching over him. His second wife, Jean Martin, the mother of 3 of his children, who remained connected to him long after their marriage had legally ended. This is the story of how one of the most beloved entertainers in American history spent his last years fading quietly out of the spotlight, and how the woman who understood him best could do nothing but witness his slow decline. Long before he was Dean Martin, he was Dino Paul Crocetti, born in 1917 in Steubenville, Ohio, a gritty steel town along the Ohio River. His parents were Italian immigrants. His father ran a barbershop, and his mother kept their crowded home filled with music and traditional cooking. Italian was the language spoken at home, and young Dino grew up more comfortable with it than with English, which made his early school years brutal. Other children mocked his accent, and the isolation he felt in the classroom pushed him to leave school entirely before finishing high school. What followed were years of odd jobs and hard living. Working in the steel mills, pumping gas, delivering milk, and even running liquor during Prohibition. For a while, he tried his hand at boxing, fighting under the ring name Kid Crochet. He didn't win much, and the fights left him with permanent physical reminders, a broken nose and scars that stayed with him long after he traded the ring for the stage. It was during these lean years, while working as a card dealer in an underground casino, that he began singing casually to entertain the gamblers. That small habit caught the attention of a local bandleader, and it became the first real crack of light in a childhood otherwise defined by hardship. He started performing under different stage names before a fellow musician convinced him that Dean Martin had the sound of a star. The name stuck, and so did the persona that came with it. Smooth, unbothered, and endlessly charming. Dean's personal life moved forward just as quickly as his career. He married young, to Elizabeth Betty McDonald, and the couple had 4 children together during the years when Dean was still fighting for recognition in small clubs and lounges. Those early years were far from glamorous. The money was inconsistent, the touring schedule brutal, and the marriage strained by both financial pressure and Dean's growing restlessness as his fame began to build. By the end of the 1940s, that first marriage had collapsed. Dean was granted custody of the children, an unusual arrangement for the era, and shortly afterward he married Jean Beager, a former beauty queen and model. Their wedding in 1949 was very much a Hollywood affair, and for years, Jean became the steady presence in Dean's life that allowed his career to fully take off. She helped raise all 7 of his children, the 4 from his first marriage and the 3 she had with him, and for a long stretch, the Martin household was viewed publicly as the picture of a stable, glamorous American family. That stability, however, was harder to maintain than it appeared. As Dean's career expanded through the 1950s and 1960s, his time away from home grew longer, and rumors about his personal life became harder to ignore. Jean, by most accounts, tolerated a great deal for the sake of the family and the image they had built together, but by the early 1970s, even her patience had limits. The couple divorced in 1973 after more than 2 decades of marriage. Dean would go on to have one more brief marriage afterward, but those who were close to him often said that his connection to Jean never truly ended. Legally divorced, but emotionally still tied to one another in a way that outlasted the marriage itself. Professionally, Dean Martin's career took a leap that few expected when he ended his decade-long partnership with comedian Jerry Lewis in the mid-1950s. At the time, critics assumed Dean would fade into obscurity without his more famous comedic partner. Instead, he reinvented himself as a solo performer, finding a new level of stardom in Las Vegas alongside Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and the rest of what would become known as the Rat Pack. On stage, Dean cultivated an image of a carefree, hard-drinking entertainer, cigarette in one hand and a cocktail in the other, stumbling gently through jokes with a loose tie and a crooked grin. It became one of the most convincing acts in show business, because in reality, Dean rarely drank as much as his stage persona suggested. Friends and fellow performers later confirmed that much of what looked like whiskey in his glass was often something far softer. The drunk persona was calculated, a character built to entertain rather than a reflection of his private habits. That performance made him a legend, but it also distanced the public from the real man behind it. Dean was, by most descriptions from those who knew him, quieter and more private than his stage character suggested. Unlike Sinatra, he rarely stayed out late gambling or partying after shows. More often, he preferred to go home, watch television, and keep to himself. His film career added even more depth to his reputation, with dramatic roles that surprised critics who had pegged him as nothing more than a lounge singer with good comedic timing. Then came his own television variety show in the mid-1960s, which became a massive ratings success built almost entirely around his laid-back charisma. He famously insisted on minimal rehearsal, letting his natural presence carry the show, and audiences loved him for it. Yet even at the peak of his fame, those closest to him noticed that success didn't seem to bring him peace. He is remembered as someone who often reflected, half joking and half serious, that luck could only carry a person so far. That sense of impermanence would prove tragically accurate as the years went on. Nothing in Dean Martin's long career or complicated personal life compared to the devastation of March 1987. His son, Dean Paul Martin, a former professional tennis player turned actor and Air National Guard pilot, was killed when his fighter jet crashed into a California mountainside during a snowstorm. He was only 35 years old. Dean Paul had always held a special place in his father's life. Friends often described the bond between them as unusually close, even by the standards of a large, blended family. The search for the wreckage took nearly a week, and by the time the loss was confirmed, something in Dean Martin seemed to break permanently. Those who knew him well said he was never the same afterward. The easy humor, the relaxed stage presence, the warmth that had defined his public image for decades, all of it dimmed almost overnight. At the time of the crash, Dean had been preparing for a highly anticipated reunion tour with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., something fans had hoped for years. He tried to continue for a short stretch of dates, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Distracted and visibly withdrawn during performances, he eventually left the tour altogether, despite Sinatra's efforts to convince him to stay. It was one of the clearest public signs that something had fundamentally changed in the man audiences thought they knew. Gene, though divorced from Dean for over a decade by that point, stepped back into his life during this period. Not as a romantic partner, but as one of the few people he would still allow close to him. She checked in on him regularly, aware that grief had hollowed him out in a way none of his previous struggles ever had. After 1987, Dean Martin gradually withdrew from public life almost entirely. The performances became rare, then stopped. He spent much of his time out of the spotlight, often dining alone at the same familiar restaurants in Beverly Hills, a routine that reportedly stayed consistent for years. It was a stark contrast to the image of the man who had once commanded packed rooms in Las Vegas with nothing more than a wink and a song. By the early 1990s, decades of heavy smoking had caught up with him physically. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, and doctors urged him to pursue treatment. According to those close to him, Dean declined further aggressive intervention, reportedly telling friends that he had lived a full life and didn't wish to prolong it through difficult medical procedures. It was a quiet, almost resigned acceptance from a man who had spent his life performing for others but chose, in the end, to face his mortality privately. His final months were spent largely out of public view, surrounded by old photographs and memories rather than the crowds and cameras that had once defined his existence. On December 25, 1995, Christmas Day, Dean Martin died at the age of 78 from complications related to acute respiratory failure. His death sent a wave of grief through the entertainment industry. Frank Sinatra, his close friend and longtime collaborator, spoke of him with deep affection, describing their bond as one that went beyond simple friendship. Days after his passing, the Las Vegas Strip dimmed its lights for several minutes in his honor, a rare gesture typically reserved only for the industry's most significant figures. Casinos that had once been filled with the sound of his music paused in collective silence for the man who had helped define an entire era of American entertainment. Dean Martin was laid to rest at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. His crypt bears a line from one of his most beloved recordings, a final nod to the song that had become inseparable from his identity. Jean Martin never remarried after her divorce from Dean. In the years following his death, she remained connected to the family they had built together, largely out of the public eye. She passed away from cancer in 2016 at the age of 89, and was laid to rest not far from where Dean himself had been buried decades earlier. Their son Richie, who had spent much of his adult life keeping his father's musical legacy alive through tribute performances and public appearances, died only weeks before Gene. It was a final, painful echo of the loss the family had endured since 1987, as though grief had never fully left the Martin family after Dean Paul's death, resurfacing again and again across the decades. Looking back at Dean Martin's life, it's easy to focus only on the glittering surface. The chart-topping songs, the Rat Pack glamour, the television success, the effortless charisma that made him one of the most beloved entertainers of his era. But beneath that surface was a man shaped as much by hardship and loss as by success, a childhood scarred by poverty and prejudice, 2 marriages that ultimately couldn't withstand the pressures of fame, and a grief over his son's death that he never appeared to recover from. Gene Martin's role in his story is often overlooked, reduced to a footnote about his personal life. But by many accounts, she remained one of the few constants in his world even after their marriage ended, present during his lowest moments, even when neither of them spoke of it publicly. Dean Martin's legacy endures through his music and his films, remembered by audiences as the embodiment of relaxed, untouchable cool. But behind that image was a far more human story, a man who built an empire out of charm while quietly carrying decades of unresolved sorrow, and a woman who, even after love had faded into history, never stopped watching over him until the very end. What do you think? Did Dean Martin ever find peace before he passed, or did the losses he carried follow him until his final days? Share your thoughts, and if you enjoyed this look back at one of Hollywood's most complicated legends, consider following for more stories from entertainment's golden age.